three, four. 1, 2, 3, 4.
December 7th, 1941, Winston Churchill sat in his study at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, when the news came through. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. He would later write that he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. After 2 years of standing virtually alone against Nazi Germany, after watching his cities burn under the Blitz, after pleading and cajoling and hoping for American intervention, it had finally happened. The United States was coming into the war. But Churchill knew something that night that would take months to materialize. Knowing America would fight was one thing. Seeing American soldiers on British soil, marching through British streets, real and present, and ready to fight alongside his exhausted nation, that would be something else entirely. Churchill had been courting American involvement since before the war even began. As First Lord of the Admiral in 1939, and then as Prime Minister from May 1940 onward, he had written letter after letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. The correspondence was extraordinary. Over 1,700 messages between them during the war years. Churchill signed his letters "former naval person" at first, a reference to his role as First Lord, establishing an intimate tone that bypassed normal diplomatic channels. The relationship was strategic, certainly, but also emotional. Churchill's mother was American, born Jenny Jerome in Brooklyn. He had always felt a connection to America, had toured the country, had friends there. But more than personal affinity, he understood what Britain needed. After the fall of France in June 1940, Britain stood alone in Western Europe against Hitler. The Soviet Union was still bound by its non-aggression pact with Germany. Churchill needed America not just as a supplier of weapons and food, but as a fighting partner. The Lend-Lease Act passed by the U.S. Congress in March 1941 had been a lifeline. American ships brought tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, but ships and supplies weren't soldiers. They couldn't hold ground or storm beaches. Throughout 1941, as German armies drove deep into the Soviet Union after Hitler's invasion in June, Churchill watched and waited and hoped that something would bring America into the fighting. Pearl Harbor did what all his eloquence could not. On December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Churchill immediately made plans to travel to Washington for a conference with Roosevelt. He arrived on December 22nd and stayed through the new year, discussing strategy, coordinating plans, building the alliance that would have to win the war. But strategy meetings in Washington were abstract. The real test would come when American soldiers arrived in Britain. The first American troops landed in Northern Ireland on January 26, 1942. They were advanced elements, small numbers, the beginning of what would become a flood. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, more arrived. By the end of the year, over 100,000 American servicemen were stationed in Britain. By the time of D-Day in June 1944, that number would exceed 1.5 million. They came by ship, crossing the Atlantic in convoys, always watching for U-boat. They landed at Liverpool, at Belfast. At various ports around the British Isles. They were young, most of them. Many had never been outside America before. They found themselves in a country that had been at war for over 2 years, a country marked by rationing and bombing damage and exhaustion. The British reaction to the Americans was complicated. There was genuine gratitude. These men were coming to help, after all, to fight a common enemy. But there was also friction. The Americans seemed impossibly wealthy by British standards. They were paid far more than British soldiers. They had access to goods that ordinary Britons hadn't seen in years. Their uniforms were better quality, their rations more abundant. The American military supplied its troops with luxuries that seemed almost obscene to a population living on rations that had been cut and cut again. The famous phrase emerged: overpaid, oversexed, and overhere. It was said with humor usually, but humor that carried an edge. British soldiers paid a fraction of what Americans earned. Watched American GIs take British girls to dances and pubs. British families surviving on rations that allowed for ounces of bacon per person per week. Heard about American mesh holes serving steak and ice cream. But beneath the friction was something deeper. Hope. relief, a sense that the tide might actually turn. Churchill felt this more acutely than anyone. He understood the mathematics of the war. Germany had conquered most of Europe. Its armies were vast, its industries producing weapons at an enormous rate. Britain was holding on, but holding on wasn't winning. The Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of German military power. But the Eastern Front was far away, and the outcome uncertain. Britain needed America's industrial capacity, its seemingly limitless resources, its fresh armies. He had seen the supply ships arriving, had tracked the numbers, had approved the plans for American bases and training facilities across Britain. But seeing the men themselves, seeing them march in formation through British streets, that would make it real in a way that shipping manifests and strategic planning documents never could. The moment came on a gray afternoon in London. The exact date is less important than what it represented. American troops were being moved through the city, a large contingent marching in formation from one station to another. These weren't the first Americans Churchill had seen in Britain by this point. Months into 1942, American soldiers were a common sight, but this was different. This was a formal march through the heart of London, through streets that had been bombed during the Blitz, past buildings that still showed damage from German raids. Churchill made sure to be there. He positioned himself where he could watch them pass. His staff knew better than to interfere when the Prime Minister wanted to witness something personally. They arranged for him to have a clear view, somewhere he could stand and watch without causing too much disruption. The Americans came marching in columns, their boots striking the pavement in rhythm. They wore their uniforms, their helmets, carried their rifles. They were young men, most of them 18, 19, 20 years old. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from New York. They had trained in camps across America, had crossed the Atlantic in crowded troop ships, had arrived in a country at war. They marched with a particular bearing of American soldiers, less rigid than British troops perhaps, but confident. They knew they were part of something enormous. They had grown up hearing about the Great War, about American doughboys going over there to fight in France. Now they were doing the same thing, following in those footsteps, coming to Europe to fight another German war. London crowds gathered to watch them pass. Office workers came out of buildings. Shopkeepers stood in doorways. People lined the sidewalks. Some clapped, some waved. Children called out to them. The Americans grinned, waved back, maintained their formation. Churchill watched in silence at first. His eyes moved along the columns, taking in the sight. His face, usually so expressive, was difficult to read. Those who stood near him later reported that his eyes were wet. He had spent 2 years carrying the weight of Britain's survival. 2 years of making speeches, rallying the nation, making desperate decisions about where to send limited resources. 2 years of watching young British men go off to fight in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, in the air over Germany. 2 years of reading casualty reports, of visiting bombed cities, of knowing that Britain was stretched to its absolute limit. And now, here were the Americans. Thousands of them, with thousands more coming. An entire nation's military power being deployed to Britain, preparing to take the fight to Hitler's Europe. Someone near Churchill asked him what he thought. The Prime Minister was silent for a moment, still watching the marching troops. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the emotion of those 2 years of standing alone. "When I see these young men," he said, "I know we are going to win this war." It was a simple statement, but it carried enormous weight. Churchill was not given to simple optimism. He understood the realities of modern warfare, understood how difficult the road ahead would be. The invasion of France was still 2 years away. The Battle of the Atlantic against German Hubert was at its height. The war in North Africa was undecided. The Soviets were locked in a desperate struggle at Stalingrad. But seeing the Americans march through London, seeing the physical manifestation of American commitment, Churchill allowed himself to believe in victory not just as a possibility, but as an inevitability, he elaborated, speaking to those around him. His words tumbling out in that characteristic Churchill manner, phrases building on phrases. "They are so young, so strong, so confident," he said, watching another column pass. "Look at them. They have come 3,000 miles to help us. They have come to fight for freedom for civilization, for everything we have been defending." His voice grew stronger. "Hitler has made his greatest mistake. He thought America would stay neutral, would stay out of Europe's wars. He thought Britain would fall or surrender. He thought wrong on both counts. Now he faces not just Britain, not just Russia, but America as well. The greatest industrial power on earth, the greatest reserve of manpower, all of it now committed to his destruction." Churchill paused, pulling out his handkerchief to wipe his eyes. He was not embarrassed by the tears. "I've waited so long for this," he said quietly. So long. The people around him understood. They had lived through the same years, the same fears. The summer of 1940, when invasion seemed imminent. The Blitz, when London burned night after night. The losses at sea. The U-boat sinking ship after ship. The defeats in France, in Greece, in Crete. The desperate holding action in North Africa. The constant question, how long can we hold out? The Americans represented the answer. Not just military power, though that was crucial. They represented vindication of everything Churchill had argued for, everything he had worked toward. His courtship of Roosevelt, his speeches about Anglo-American partnership, his belief that the English-speaking peoples would stand together. All of it was being proven right in the most tangible way possible. As the march continued, Churchill's mood shifted from emotional to analytical. He began pointing out details to his staff. "Notice their equipment," he said. "Modern, well-made. They have the industrial capacity to equip millions of men like this. Millions." He watched their faces. They are eager. They want to fight. That eagerness will cost some of them their lives. But it will also carry them through things that tired men cannot do. He was already thinking ahead, planning how to use this American energy. How to coordinate British experience with American strength. "We must train them properly," he said. "They are brave, but inexperienced. We have been fighting for 2 years. We know things they do not know yet. We must teach them what we have learned, and we must learn from them as well." Someone mentioned the friction between British and American troops. The complaints about PE differences and American abundance. Churchill waved it away impatiently. "Of course, there is friction. Put any 2 groups of young men together, and there will be friction. But they are on our side. That is what matters. They are here. They are real, and they are going to help us win." The march took over an hour. Column after column of American soldiers passing through London. Churchill stayed for all of it, watching until the last troops had gone by. He seemed reluctant to leave, as if the sight was sustaining him, feeding something he had been running on empty for too long. When it was finally over, he turned to his staff. "I want to meet some of them," he said. "Aren't for me to visit an American base. I want to talk to these young men. Want to thank them personally?" The visits were arranged over the following months. Churchill made a point of visiting American units stationed in Britain. He would arrive unannounced sometimes, or with minimal warning. Wanting to see the troops as they actually were, not dressed up for a formal inspection, he would walk through their camps, talk to small groups, ask them where they were from, what they thought of Britain, whether they were being treated well. The American soldiers were often startled to find the British Prime Minister suddenly in their midst. Churchill was instantly recognizable. The round figure, the bulldog face, the ever-present cigar. Asterisk, he would shake hands, make jokes, ask questions. He wanted them to know they were appreciated, wanted them to understand what their presence meant to Britain. In one camp, he found a group of soldiers from Texas. "Texas!" he exclaimed. "I have been to Texas. Wonderful state, vast and full of energy. You Texans are known for your fighting spirit. We shall need that spirit in the days ahead." The soldiers grinned, pleased that this famous British leader knew something about their home. At another base, he encountered soldiers who had just arrived, who were still processing the reality of being in Britain. "You have come a long way," Churchill told them. "You have left your homes, your families, everything familiar. You have come to a country that has been at war for over 2 years, that is tired and worn. But I tell you this, your arrival has lifted our spirits more than you can possibly know. When we see you, we see hope. We see strength. We see victory. He meant every word. Churchill understood symbolism, understood the power of morale. But this wasn't just symbolism. The Americans were real military power, real divisions that could be deployed, real air squadrons that could bomb German cities, real ships that could protect convoys. The strategic implications were enormous. Churchill and his military chiefs began planning operations that would have been impossible before American entry. North Africa could be reinforced. An invasion of Italy could be contemplated, and eventually the great invasion of France could be planned. Operation Overlord D-Day, the massive amphibious assault that would require American troops, American landing craft, American air power, American everything. But in that moment, watching the Americans march through London, Churchill wasn't thinking about specific operations. He was thinking about what it meant that these men were here at all. For 2 years, Britain had fought on, but always with the question hanging over everything. Can we actually win? Can we defeat Germany? Or are we just postponing the inevitable? The Americans answered that question. Yes, Britain could win. Not alone, but with allies. With American industrial might and Soviet manpower and British determination, yes, Germany could be defeated. Churchill had said in his famous speech after Dunkirk in June 1940, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." It was magnificent defiance, but defiance based on will, not certainty. Now watching the Americans march through London, he could add a new certainty, and we shall win. The relationship between British and American forces would have its challenges. There were disagreements about strategy. Churchill wanted to attack Germany through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, through Italy and the Balkans. The Americans, particularly General George Marshall, wanted a direct assault across the Channel into France. There were tensions about command structures, about who would lead combined operations. There were the inevitable cultural clashes between British and American soldiers. But beneath all of that was the fundamental reality that Churchill grasped that day, watching the march. America was in the war, fully committed, and that changed everything. The young men marching through London that day would fight in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, in Germany itself. Many of them would die. American casualties in the European theater would exceed 300,000 with over 100,000 dead. They would fight at places whose names would become legendary. Omaha Beach, the Bulge, the Hurricane Forest, the Rhine Crossing. But they would win. Alongside British, Canadian, French, Polish, and other Allied forces. Alongside the massive Soviet armies grinding forward from the east, the Americans would help crush Nazi Germany. The war would last another 3 years after that march through London. 3 years of brutal fighting, but the outcome, from the moment America fully committed, was ultimately decided. Churchill knew this. Standing there watching the Americans pass, he knew it. The emotion he felt, the tears in his eyes, came from relief as much as joy. Relief that the burden would be shared. Relief that Britain would not have to stand alone anymore. Relief that victory was now possible, not just as a desperate hope, but as a realistic goal. In his memoirs written after the war, Churchill would return again and again to the theme of Anglo-American partnership. He would write about the special relationship between Britain and America, would argue for maintaining close ties in the post-war world. Some of this was strategic calculation. Britain would need American support in the Cold War that followed, but some of it was genuine feeling. Born in those dark years when American help meant the difference between survival and defeat. The march through London was not the first time Churchill saw American troops in Britain, and it would not be the last. But it represented something crucial. The moment when American involvement became real and visible, when the alliance moved from diplomatic agreements and shipping manifests to actual soldiers marching through British streets. Churchill had spent 2 years holding Britain together through force of will and eloquence. He had given speeches that rallied the nation, had made decisions that kept Britain in the fight, had worked tirelessly to build the alliance that would win the war. But will and eloquence could only do so much. At some point, you needed armies, needed soldiers, needed the physical power to fight back, The Americans brought that power, and watching them march through London, Churchill allowed himself to believe fully for perhaps the first time since becoming Prime Minister in May 1940 that Britain would not just survive, but would win. "When I see these young men," he had said, "I know we are going to win this war." It was not a boast. It was not propaganda. It was a statement of fact spoken by a man who had carried the weight of Britain's survival for 2 years, and who could finally, watching those American soldiers march, set that weight down and share it with allies who had the strength to help carry it. The war would grind on. There would be setbacks and losses, difficult decisions, and terrible casualties. But the fundamental equation had changed. Germany now faced not just Britain's defiance, but America's might. And that Churchill knew, watching those young Americans march through, London streets would make all the asterisks. Don't forget to subscribe WW2 Untold YouTube family.